Okay, hello everyone, welcome to the next talk. We got Noah Kantrovitz to talk about consumption is fractal, open source sustainability.
So thank you very much to Rachel for introducing me. So that's me in all of the places. I am an infrastructure engineer at a company called RideCell, and as you mentioned, I'm here today to talk about open source sustainability. So before we talk about sustainability, let's lay out a little bit of scope of what I'm going to be talking about. There are some very specific opinions about what open source software is or is not. I'm not really going to get into that. I'm going to take a much more general stance about what is or is not open. I'm also not wading into open source versus free software debate, because I don't like flame wars on the internet. Let's look at a couple of types of projects under the general banner of open source. The majority of projects, by the numbers, one person, they write some code that does a thing, and they put it on GitHub, because why not? This is how I got my personal start in open source, writing plugins for the Track ticket management system. But the more visible projects in the open source world are the big ones. Projects so vast and omnipresent, it's really easy to think of these as just part of the fabric of the universe. Like, obviously, they just have always existed. And some of these projects get even bigger and turn into collaborations between multiple companies, and they set up dedicated legal entities to operate under. The newer venue, similar to the dedicated legal entity, but much smaller, is to get some VC money, sweet, sweet free money. The company usually acts as the steward for an open source project and then sells some stuff on the side, which we'll get into later. What I call mirage projects, these are sort of an offshoot of the giant, feels like the fabric of the universe thing, except they're usually much smaller than you think. So for example, Python is on that list. There's probably a lot fewer core Python devs. I mean, Nick knows this more specifically, but there's probably a lot fewer core Python devs than you might imagine, especially if you think of Python as like this huge global project that runs the universe. It's only like a dozen people work on it on any given year. But anyway, we saw this with OpenSSL after the Heartbleed vulnerability, that all of a sudden the entire world woke up one day and realized that the global TLS infrastructure was run by a single-digit number of volunteers. Some older projects, especially big Linux packagers, they tend to feel very, very stuffy compared to the newer GitHub generation of project structures. But that has an important function. These projects exist to survive basically forever. No matter what contributors come and go, the project will thunder on. And some open source projects can really only be described as crazy moonshots, sort of built around a single idea or single goal, and whatever the project needs to do to make that happen, they will do. And in my very wide view of open source, I also include non-software projects in there too, Stack Overflow, Wikipedia. This conference itself, this conference is open source. Like, there's no source code per se, it's run by humans, but this is an open source project in all functional organizational capacities. And obviously, this is not a complete list of every type of open source project out there, but that's sort of the general breadth and scope of what I'm talking about when I say open source that needs to be sustainable. So I talked about those first two words. What about the third? Literally speaking, sustainability means having a project that exists today, it should exist tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that, and so on. Money and time are important, and we will definitely get to those, but the fundamental limiting factor on most open source projects is the rate of burnout of contributors and maintainers. Most projects fail because people don't want to work on them anymore. Most common symptoms of burnout are these three things: a cycle of feeling guilty about letting down your users, dread about working on the project, and finally bitterness towards the project itself, or sometimes even the users of that project. So open source projects have taken over the world. In almost every facet of technology, communal resources have pushed us further and faster. And I want this pace of progress to continue. Hopefully, we all want this pace of progress to continue. Open licensing is very important, but with that interconnectedness and cross-pollination of ideas that open source and open licensing allow, that comes with that is interdependence. So it's great that an open source project, you can fork it on GitHub if it goes fallow, but if there's no one there to pick up a fallen banner, then that's not actually sustainability in and of itself. And if I can digress for a moment on why I think open source itself is important, I think that collectively we can build things better and faster than any single company. There's a lot of problems in software where there's not really a market value. There's no easy way to quantify the value to a specific customer or a specific end user. But collectively, we can all say this is important, and we all collectively benefit from it. But OK, open source rules the world, and I think that is amazing, clearly. I'm hopefully very obviously excited about open source. But also, clearly, I think there's problems with the system, or I wouldn't be up here giving this talk. How did we end up with a worldwide ecosystem of technology built on the backs of a relatively tiny number of volunteers? we want a globally simplistic answer, infrastructure investment is lagging across the board, not just in software or even just in engineering. Bridges and dams, for example, they rarely show returns in the next quarter or the next year or the next decade, if you can even put a value on a bridge. If your focus is only on earnings for the next quarter, and very often these days it is, these kinds of things are going to slip. But as you can see from the title of the talk, I think there's also a deeper structural answer in how things are made. I can only put my brain towards building one thing at a time. If you believe you can multitask, that's great. You're probably not actually correct about that. But still, general idea, you can only build one thing at a time. Production is single-threaded, but at the same time as you're doing that, you are using probably hundreds of other projects and tools built by other people, some commercial, some open source. But in the best case scenario, there's always going to be more users than there are contributors or maintainers. And that imbalance spiraled far out of control. Even a really simple project, I just sort of did this off the top of my head of a dependency analysis of the kinds of things that a simple Django app might sit on top of. It's a lot. It's a mountain of complexity. This is also sometimes shown more humorously by XKCD, but it's the same general idea. As we build these better and better abstractions, it becomes really easy to forget just how much is down there under the hood. But why all the interest in sustainability lately? Way back when open source was just some crazy college students, basically everyone that consumed open source also produced it. Maybe I worked on GCC and you worked on Bash, but we both benefited from each other, so it was sort of a mutually beneficial relationship. But over time, that balance has eroded. More people pull value out of the system than are putting it back in. As the roughly third-ish wave of open source developers, it's hard to put exact numbers on that, they're reaching middle age, they're starting to have kids, they're deciding that other hobbies are more interesting. In a lot of cases with projects, there's just no one there to pick up that fallen banner. And so here we are, sustainability problems. It's hard to pick a patient zero. It was probably either LAMP, PHP, MySQL, Apache, or the Ruby on Rails stack that really got the ball rolling on corporate use of open source. VC-funded startups realized that they could switch to a free as in beer toolchain and save a whole lot of money. But the VCs didn't know about that, so they kept giving the same size checks, effectively. If I'm being cynical, those early startups just pocketed the difference in the VC checks. But I'm sure a lot of them used it to sort of double down and figure out how to build better software for this whole web thing, because it was the early 90s and no one really knew what was going on with the web yet. But all good bubbles must come to an end. And by now, both startups and big companies alike know that there are zero-cost software stacks out there, and a lot of them are really, really high quality. For a lot of young startups, using open source software is not just a technical choice. They literally can't afford anything else. Like, who's going to go buy Oracle at a small startup? At the end of the day, open source and capitalism are at loggerheads. Capitalism requires privatization, and open source is the literal opposite of that. As long as the bulk of companies continue to draw more value from the commons they're putting back in, we're going to have a sustainability problem. Much of the interaction between capitalism and open source is from intellectual property, but I had a whole series of talks on that last year, so I'll just refer you to that URL, which will be at the end of the talk again. If you want more info on how IP shapes open source, although warning, that talk is very US-centric, because I don't know Australian law nearly as well as I do US law. Okay, so that's the general answer to why do we have a sustainability problem. I'm sure that in most of your cases, you came in convinced of that, and I probably just spent the last 10 minutes boring you. But what about some specific projects that had specific sustainability problems? So these two are both very close to my heart. React and RethinkDB are both in the general NoSQL orbit. They were both originally built by VC-backed companies, but both projects were entirely open source from the beginning. One of the founders of RethinkDB has a fantastic postmortem on why he feels like the company didn't succeed, and I think it should be required reading for all open source maintainers, and probably all startup founders too. But roughly speaking, for both of these, databases are a really saturated market, both in terms of money and in terms of mindshare. Whatever your feelings on Postgres or MySQL or even Redis, they've set really high bars on what is available for $0. So people just aren't really willing to pay for databases anymore. Big player in the Android open source world is Cyanogen and their OS distribution CyanogenMod. In 2016, there was a big management shakeup, and they took a look at their books, and they decided, we're not actually getting very much by being an open source project. We spend a lot of money on user support. We lose out on revenue, because there's some number of people, not all, but some, that would pay for the software if it wasn't free. Why are we doing this? And so they've kept it around. Cyanogen still exists, but they just decided it wasn't worth being open source. Two notable individual cases, why the Lucky Stiff from the Ruby community and Mark Pilgrim from the Python community. This is not a call out or a critique of either of these people. It's not just projects that this kind of lack of sustainability problem can affect. It can actually also be individuals. And kind of a more general problem, I know I said these were going to be specific projects, but this one a lot of people deal with. The idea of having serially new contributors showing up, contributing one bug fix, and then disappearing. On one hand, these are really important. These are the users that are going to give you your fixes to documentation, new user experience, new user onboarding. They're absolutely crucial. On the other hand, it takes an inordinate amount of effort and emotional energy to shepherd even just one person through their first contribution to a new project. Doing those like 12 times in a month or even more, it gets to be just a lot to handle. Okay, so that's things that detract from sustainability. How about things that improve it? A big part of a project is how it's run, and that can have a similarly large effect on its sustainability. Benevolent dictator for life is where a lot of projects start from, and everyone here is here for Python, so they probably are familiar with this model. One person starts a project. In Python's case, it was Guido van Rossum. Over time, more contributors and maintainers will join, but that one person stays in control of the overall vision or direction of the project. This can work great for a young project. It keeps a lot of coherence about the technical direction or overall vision of the project. But as the project grows, it can become increasingly frustrating as all decisions have to be run through that one person. So new contributors will sit there and wait for a while the BDFL decides whether or not their patch can be accepted, and so on. Some projects that start with a single BDFL, like say the Linux kernel, eventually fragment into a series of BDFLs that all operate as the same project but also independent projects. So if you've ever gone looking in, say, the Linux kernel tree, there are actually a dozen or so projects that are Linux. There's a bunch of maintainers. They all operate semi-independently. They trade patch with each other. Some of the trees are more authoritative than other trees. But this can be great for those maintainers. They operate with a high level of autonomy. They don't have to wait for each other. But again, if you've ever tried submitting a patch to Linux kernel, it can be utterly incomprehensible to new people. So if we don't want that sort of fragmented multi-BDFL approach, sometimes a hierarchy can help. Apache Software Foundation is kind of famous for this. They have a real structural hierarchy for decision making. Again, this can be nice in some cases because it can be really obvious how to, say, resolve a dispute. If two developers disagree about how a thing should be implemented or if a patch should be accepted, there's a decision-making structure in place to solve that. But it can also bring a lot of social overhead. So to try to reduce some of that overhead, some projects have moved to a council or special interest group or SIG approach, where it's not quite hierarchical. It's more sort of federated special groups that each have sway over a particular area. And sometimes if the contributor base is stable enough over time, so you've got mostly longtime contributors, you can just kind of forgo most of the formal rules and operate on rough consensus. People will still disagree from time to time, but you just say that doesn't happen that often. We're just going to handle it on a case-by-case basis. Like with the city-states model, this can be great for longtime contributors because it feels very freeing, but again, like with the city-states, it can be utterly incomprehensible for new people because you get a lot of invisible or shadow power structures. And so on, lots of models. Again, like with the project type lists, this is not an exhaustive analysis. Each project is going to pull from both this and from the project type list, try to come up with a set of vaguely coherent rules and regulations and processes to try to manage their own development as needed for the specific people, the specific project, and so on. Conway's law states that the output of any team is going to eventually look a lot like the org chart of that team. It's intended to be a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but it's still remarkably accurate. A choice of leadership and decision-making structures will affect not just the humans, but the software that those humans create. But unfortunately, it can sometimes be a little bit hard to tell which direction to move in to improve sustainability. So on some projects, adding more decision support and more formal hierarchies, that could take a load off of your maintainers. It gives them formal ways to work out disputes. It means they don't have to feel like they are on the hook for deciding every pull request, and so on. On the other hand, on the same project, maybe another person will see that as an increase to bureaucracy or more paperwork, and it's going to push that person further away from the project. So whenever you're tweaking or designing governance structures, make sure you have an open dialogue with all of your maintainers and hopefully your community as a whole so you can figure out which direction to turn the knob. And if you get it wrong, change gears. Okay, so I mentioned before that open licensing is really important. I'm going to kind of speed through this because we're running a bit low on time. But the idea of copyleft licensing or open source licensing in general is that even if the project goes completely fallow, it has no maintainers left, the code is still available. But what about cases where the license can be more than just a backstop? The full intricacies of licensing are best left to that intellectual property talk I mentioned before. But even though the GPL doesn't really care about money, it does, in its own way, care about sustainability. We'll talk a little bit more about dual licensing later, but the idea of copyleft in general is that the code changes have to be made available to the users of the project. That doesn't always mean it'll be available to the maintainers, but it usually does. So the idea is that you don't want someone to fork your project, make some changes, keep them proprietary, and then they get the sales or the donations or whatever and pull resources away from your project. That means, hypothetically, if you are under a copyleft license, if they do that, they have to make the patches available to the users or hopefully you, and then you can put that back into your project, and then they won't be sucking resources away from your project. But really, how often does this happen? It's not zero. Certainly, the Linux kernel itself has had numerous problems with this over the years of people making proprietary modifications and making life difficult for users and maintainers alike. But it's definitely the exception. My personal view is that copyleft probably causes more problems than it solves, but that's a very personal decision. Maybe your project is different than mine. But okay, in the end, maintaining open source projects means time, and time is money. So the simplest funding model, don't have one. Be a volunteer project. And those are great. I love volunteer projects. Maybe you love coding for its own sake. Maybe you want to develop a professional portfolio so it's easier to get hired. Or maybe there's just a bug in a thing that you do, a thing that you use for work, and you really want to get it fixed, and you're willing to put in that extra time at home. But always remember, volunteering your time is an act of altruism. It is really easy to get stuck in that cycle of guilt and bitterness that I mentioned before. But okay, next step up, working on open source during your normal work hours. This might be either a project that belongs to your company that you're improving, or there's a bug fix that you develop for one of the projects that you use and you want to contribute that back upstream. It's a great option when you can do it. I highly recommend it if possible, but a lot of employers are not super on board with this yet. And the next step up from that, if instead of just one person working on open source in company time, everyone works on open source in the company time, or at least most people. VC funding, as mentioned before, not really a long-term solution, so eventually you're going to need some of the other things on this list to repay your investors, but it could potentially be a way to get a new or nascent project off the ground. So now we enter the realm of project funding strategies for people that are trying to be self-sustaining, meaning that you have at least most of your development time paid for by donations or grants or whatever that are coming in. Most popular most popular funding strategy is selling support contracts. But this can be really hit or miss. A lot of smaller companies probably just can't afford your support contract, and a lot of bigger companies will just say, oh, we don't need that. We'll just support it internally and it'll be fine. So you can try this, but you have to very carefully design your pricing structures, and you have to have a very good sales team usually. Examples of this include MySQL and Java, both from Oracle, are largely funded via support contracts. Sometimes the project itself isn't set up for this kind of thing, so the developers will sort of fracture into multiple smaller commercial entities, but with the same general goal of funding their time spent on the main project itself. This is, for example, a very common thing in the Postgres community. So after selling support, the next most common models are all based around having some kind of open core project and selling related closed source proprietary software on top of that, adding additional functionality for specific use cases, almost always related to big enterprise use cases. Sometimes there can be clear places to add these, like SAML login is a really common enterprise-only feature, cross-team reporting, LDAP integration, that kind of thing. But it can be a little bit difficult sometimes because you have to find a balance. You want to give good features to your open source users. That's probably why you're building the project in the first place. But every time you give a feature to your open source side, that is potentially lost revenue. This is very popular in the DevOps space. Chef, Puppet, Salt, and Ansible all have commercial add-ons like this. Dual licensing is a special case. Instead of selling different software, you're actually selling the same software. So it's the exact same thing they could get for free, but under different license terms. The common case for this is if you've got something available under a copyleft license and a company wants to take it and modify it and not share the patches, they will purchase a commercial license from you that doesn't have the copyleft restrictions. This isn't super common anymore, but Qt is still, for example, using this model. And a late-breaking example of this model, maybe kind of, we're not sure how this is going to work out. Redis announced, I think it was 2 days ago, that they are adding new licensing terms to several projects related to Redis, not Redis itself, for now, that prevents anyone else from selling commercial hosting services with those projects. Unless, of course, those people buy a commercial license. While I certainly wish Redis the best, and they are an important project, the community reaction to this has been extremely negative so far. But okay, similar to selling support contracts is professional services, or ProServe. This is usually some mix of selling consulting to help people either best use or deploy your project, customization, writing custom plugins, scripts, stuff like that, or if it's a server-based tool, writing a hosted version or SaaS option. Examples of this too numerous to count, as with some of the others. Pivotal Software is a big one. They sell lots of services around Cloud Foundry and a lot of their other projects. Grants have been a mainstay of the academic world since time immemorial, and they're slowly becoming more available for software projects. The general idea is you figure out what you want to work on, you write up a list of reasons why this is important, you figure out how long it's going to take, and you use that to work out an amount of money to ask someone for, and hopefully they then give you that money. PSF probably wasn't the first to offer open source grants, but they're the first one I ran into. And other organizations within the Python ecosystem have also taken up this role of offering project-specific grants in the Python world. The MOS grants program, and Mozilla has a broader grants program in general. These are more broad. They're not ecosystem specific. They're for any tool that is generally part of Mozilla's core mission of improving the open web. Or one step yet broader, Google's Open Source Programs Office, and a lot of other big companies, Facebook and Microsoft, also have similar groups. Their mandate is to provide grants to support any open source project that their host company uses, which is usually basically all of them. But a big problem with grants, like VC funding or any other non-renewable income stream, it's highly dependent on how good your time estimates were. If it turns out that you just missed something in your time estimate and it's going to take another 6 weeks, that might end up coming out of your own pocket. And we all know engineers are super great at time estimates, right? Never make any mistakes there? But okay, most common option, finally, let's talk about donations. If you like this project, send me a few bucks on PayPal, right? It's great. Straight up tip jar is the simplest solution, certainly, and it's really easy to set up. Like, everyone can set up a simple PayPal link or Venmo link or whatever. I don't actually know what's popular in Australia these days, sorry. And it can be really heartening to get a couple bucks from someone every now and then, but it's probably not a really big impact on sustainability. If you're not already okay with working for free, that $10, it's not actually paying for your time, it's just kind of a nice note. And speaking personally as a maintainer, just send me the note. You don't need to send me the $10 if that's more difficult for you. I'm glad that you are enjoying my software, but this isn't really gonna impact sustainability strongly one way or another. Slightly more stable solution is some kind of recurring donation. So that allows you to plan out roughly how much income you're going to get each month, and you can figure out how to allocate your time based on that. Patreon mostly owns this market right now, and it's super easy to get set up with, but Patreon hasn't really made very many inroads with the software world, so it can be difficult to get very much in the way of patrons. Open Collective is sort of trying to bridge the gap, being as simple to set up as Patreon for recurring donations, while addressing some of the issues and mostly social constructs that limits Patreon's use in the software world. Unlike Patreon, Open Collective doesn't have the same kind of donation incentive structure, although the project could potentially do it themselves. The fees are also almost double Patreon's in the default configuration, so be careful of that. Both one-time and recurring donations, however, share the same base problem. In a lot of cases, in my experience, it's basically all just friends paying each other for the software that they work on, which isn't what I want. What I want is for the companies that are making money off of my software to give me some of those resources so that I can improve the software and we can both benefit. But okay, some other donation options. I did actually run a Kickstarter a couple years ago to run some open source time. It was successful, but it was extremely stressful, and I really don't recommend this for anyone. So that example I mentioned with the grants, yeah, that wasn't hypothetical. I misestimated my schedule by about 3 months. And Kickstarter, like a grant, the amount of money you get is the amount of money you get. So good luck with that. Some mid-sized projects that are looking to tempt donations from companies rather than from individuals will try to get nonprofit status, but setting up a nonprofit by yourself is incredibly difficult. So you usually want to join some kind of umbrella organization that can accept donations on your behalf and then distribute them appropriately. I want to highlight the great work of the Software Freedom Conservancy, which has helped dozens of projects set up this kind of umbrella arrangement. If you're interested in being able to accept tax-free donations, I would highly recommend talking to them. They've got a contact link on their website. Outside of the simple logistical issues, a common problem with donations is working out how to divide them if there's more than one maintainer. Sometimes you can kind of sidestep this and spend them on swag for the project or server hosting, but that's probably not what you wanted the donations in the first place. That doesn't pay your rent. So you're usually going to have to come up with some way to figure out how to split the money, and that can lead to either hurt feelings if people are valued numerically more than one another, or perverse incentives, like if you give out the donations based on number of commits, well, all of a sudden I'm going to have 100 one-line commits. Not unsolvable, but be careful about this. Make sure that everyone is actually okay with your solution, not just saying they're okay. While money makes the world go round, a lot of donations are going to be in the form of discounted services or free credits. Be aware that you can ask people for these kinds of things. For example, Rackspace has very graciously hosted part of my CI infrastructure for many years. It can often be easier for a company to give out this kind of in-kind donation of their own project or service rather than giving you money. But okay, I'm running low on time, so enough about donations. Some less common but interesting funding strategies. A couple of projects have tried to fund themselves using books. So Lua did this notably, but this can be a very hard thing to navigate because you want your free documentation to be good enough to use the project, but you still need enough information to sell. More often this ends up being that the book is just freely available online, but you're selling physical copies, but that severely impacts your revenue. Selling ad space could theoretically be a lucrative option. Ad sales basically run the entire internet, but it's not really that useful for most software projects. It's really easy to set up something like Google Ads, but it doesn't really bring in much revenue, and it usually just annoys people. Negotiating your ad deals, things like Read the Docs do that. They can be much more lucrative, but it's also much more time consuming. Bug bounties are very common in the InfoSec world, but they're not really that common for just generic software features and bug fixes and things like that. You'll see them from time to time, but it's not really enough to sustainably fund a project. Worker co-ops are a really deep rabbit hole that I don't have time to go into, or even probably the expertise to go into. But things like Snowdrift and Tidelift are starting to try to figure out what are ways to have worker-owned co-ops around open source. And if we look further out into the future, science, medicine, and the arts have national and even international organizations that fund, usually in the form of basic research, projects that don't reap commercial rewards directly, but they are the basis for future work, either scientific or cultural. And that sounds a lot like open source projects, or at least a lot of open source projects. Maybe one day we could see a National Institute of Software, a National Institute of Engineering. And if I can do really big, universal basic income is probably the theoretical long-term solution to this if we could ever figure out how to make it work. It would allow people to spend time on what they think is valuable, even if the market doesn't value it, but no one really knows how to make UBI work. So hopefully by now I've convinced you all that sustainability is important and that it is possible, just difficult. And you've got some ideas on how to move in that direction for your own projects. As I've stressed before, the enemy of open source is most often burnout, not technical failings. Practice empathy, both when making and using open source software, and it can help a lot with sustainability. If you make money using open source, which is almost every company these days, if you're making money at all, be on the lookout for ways that you can help the projects you depend on. And most of all, be ready for changes. So maybe you are using a really important library, and that library author, they have a kid, and they just don't have time for it anymore. That's okay. Like, don't harangue them. Please don't try to guilt trip them into maintaining the library. It's fine. That was a donated project. All of a sudden, you're just not getting that free work. That's just how it goes. Maybe you maintain a niche but popular command line tool, and you get a new job, and you don't need it anymore. That's okay. Market is unmaintained. You are not failing anybody. All of this is okay. We've only been building software for a couple of decades. We don't really know how to do it very well. We've got a lot to learn about how to build software in the best way. So thank you very much. There's too many people to thank individually for all of their advice and wisdom, but I do want to call out three in particular that are especially luminaries in this field. Nadia, Russell, and Eric really do help to define a lot of the thoughts and ideas around open source sustainability. I highly recommend all of their writings if you're interested in diving deeper into this. And we've got a couple of minutes for questions.
Cool. Thank you, Noah.
Hi, and thanks. I work for a company who's already interested in have a mindset of wanting to contribute, but we sort of have limited success in actually getting our libraries out there. How would you encourage me as just one of the team to sort of think and plan and suggest things that can be open sourced that we produce?
I mean, anything can be open sourced. Like, whether or not other people use it is an entirely separate thing. Like, if it is valuable, then it's more about marketing than it is about deciding to run something as an open source project is more a statement of values about how you think the project should be built over time. It shouldn't generally be seen as a marketing tactic. Like, how you market your project is independent of if it is open source or not. Certainly, it is a useful marketing tactic to be able to say it's on GitHub, so it's really easy to get. But like, you could put the source somewhere else, and it would still be easy to get, and it wouldn't be under an open source license.
I guess I'm like, by default, our stuff is internal, and I think we have a sense where we want to be contributing, and so I guess it's that. I wonder if there's just any advice on sort of the sorts of things I can be looking out for that would be good candidates to promote, to suggest to the rest of the team that we could do it.
I think I'm not actually answering your question, but I'm going to say it anyway. Look at your requirements.txt, figure out what projects are in there that you probably couldn't survive without, and go and give them money. I think that's not actually what you're asking. I think what you're asking is, how do we figure out what of our own projects to open source? But
Yeah.
that's not really a sustainability question per se. That's
Okay.
more of a technical and really economic decision by your company. My personal answer is all of it, everything. There's almost nothing that you probably shouldn't open source, because what most companies do, their competitive advantage is very tiny. So my company provides services around cars and mobility. Our actual value is that we can interface with car vendors. So maybe we keep some of that separate, but we have a whole bunch of internal code for what I deal with deploying microservices. That is not related to my company's core mission or value in any way. That should all be open source. It can be politically difficult, but that's a separate problem.
Sorry, but we've run out of time for
Yes.
questions now. So
Sorry, come up and ask.
Yep, come up and ask Noah. Thanks, Noah, again for such an insightful talk. And as a token of our appreciation, thank you.